Hello, History 365. So here we are, mercifully at the end. This will be the last lecture for this rather bizarre semester. And actually, I thought my topic for the last lecture would be musing on when should this course end. So the University of Albany offers a two-course sequence on warfare, war and society, predominantly focused on Europe. And a decision was made not too long ago, but back in the day, to divide it at 1789. And one reason that I kind of like talking about periodization is it's not just an administrative thing that we have to do to package undergraduate courses. Periodization is actually a really serious analytic tool that forces us as historians to think about continuity and discontinuity in the human experience and the problem of change over time. And these are fundamental questions that historians ask when we examine the societies that we're studying. So if you're looking at Europe from the Stone Age, when we started, all the way up until the present day, if you had to divide that in two, with the thematic topic of warfare, where would your dividing point be? And that's actually what I sort of just want to muse on today. And I hope that in actually thinking about that, we'll actually start thinking about the changes that are happening in the early modern period in terms of war and society and culture in Europe. So the date that I got sort of stuck with, because I came into this course as an ancient historian, was 1789. And there's a reason they picked 1789 that is completely obvious and really highly defensible. And that's the year the French Revolution breaks out. Now, for our purposes, as an endpoint, that's a little anticlimactic because the changes, the discontinuity that the French Revolution brings about really all project forward. Not only does it dramatically disrupt political systems, political philosophy, how people in Western Europe think about governance, but it does lead to a huge, violent period of warfare that we call both the Wars of the French Revolution and then subsequently the Napoleonic Wars. And in many ways, it's the same series of wars, even though the government in France changes from a radical republic to an imperial system under Napoleon. But the basic sort of dynamics of the wars, there's a high degree of continuity in terms of who the antagonists are, particularly Britain, Prussia to the east, Russia, Austria as well. So at any rate, on one hand, I think you could say, hey, look, we're ending in 1789. This is a whimper for us, but there's going to be both a huge new series of wars, and those wars do point towards modernity in a kind of fundamental way, namely the French, as they find themselves starting to lose, institute something called a levée en masse. Basically, they seek to engage in not only mass subscription of military-aged men, but actually to mobilize the entire population, bringing in older men to help with logistics and to make arms. And the idea is this starts to point towards the total mobilization of society that we will definitely see going forward, whether it's the extraordinary large mobilizations of the American Civil War in the 19th century, or the total warfare of the world wars, which involve tapping into almost every aspect of your society, draining almost every resource available in the service of armed conflict. And in some ways, again, the French Revolution and the French levée en masse points towards that. So 1789 is actually a perfectly reasonable dividing point, even if it sort of feels like a whimper for us, because all of that happens at the start of the next course, which you should take. It's currently it's taught by Professor Richard Fogarty and is offered periodically by our history department. So that said, this is a little anticlimactic for us, and as I've been dealing with the material, I've wondered, could there be different places where we could reasonably end this course that might better kind of frame a discontinuity? And when we think about continuity and discontinuity, I think we can think about it in two ways. One way that we can think about discontinuity is an event. a massive transformative event, and since this is a military history class, we might think like a war, that has so many aftershocks that it's worth treating it as your dividing line. And not only, and those aftershocks could be practical, they could also even be psychological, in that people treat this moment as a moment that, in the way that they structure the narrative of their lives, things will never be the same. We can think about an event-based dividing line, and incidentally, this course has one, the French Revolution. That's a pretty big, important event. We can also think about a development-based dividing line. Namely, now this obviously is less satisfactory because it may not be as dramatic or as sudden or stark, and yet a development is, in some ways, sort of a development. That's not necessarily a battle or a war or a treaty, but nonetheless reflects a significant shift that over a sort of finite period of time moves us into a different direction. So I'll actually just ruminate on, I'm not that old, but let me ruminate about sort of an event and a development that in my life I see sort of as dividing lines. The event would be September 11th, which happened on when I was day 2 as a freshman at college. In fact, I think I was registering for courses when I heard about September 11th. Now, that was a very emotional event. It has had a psychological impact on me. And so, when I kind of think about how maybe the world shifted, or, if you ask me, when did the 20th century end, I would say September 11th, 2001. That's, if I had to draw a different, when's the difference for me, what's 20th century and what's 21st century, that's the dividing line for me. Let me talk about development, though. When I was about 12, my family got a computer and hooked up to the internet. This would have been in the 90s, or 94, 95. Anyways, maybe I was a little older than 12. I actually don't remember exactly when it happened, but I remember it happening. And looking back, thinking about how my life changed, how my adult life is different from, say, the adult life of my father or grandfather, that's a pretty important development. That's one that harkens in radical change. And yet it was an event. I can actually remember exactly what year or day it was, where I obviously can, literally, for the September 11th, 2001 attacks. So let's sort of, I just throw that out as two different ways of thinking about discontinuity, events and development. So let's look at what might be some events and some developments that might provide discontinuities for us to end our course. Well, one event we've talked about, the French Revolution and the subsequent wars that flow from it. They really don't end until the Battle of Waterloo and the subsequent Congress of Vienna. Could there be any other events that might make sense? Well, one event I would say would be the 30 Years' War, a massive, violent, disruptive war, and yet one that also, looking forward, among its many aftershocks, is not only does it develop changes in military technology, but also comes to define the concept of the nation state. In giving the imperial states in Germany, who technically are still under the auspices of the Holy Roman Empire, by saying whoever governs those states, whatever princes govern those states, they have the right to determine the religious makeup of that state. That defines national sovereignty in a way that clearly will be important when we think about nation states and the broader kind of geopolitics and even cultural politics of the 18th, 19th, 20th, even into the 21st century. Sort of Wilsonian self-determination after World War I, even though it kind of fails, in some ways is influenced by the kinds of concepts of nationhood that are discussed in the Treaty of Westphalia. So you could actually say, I think, because as an event, both the war, the devastation that it causes, the disruption that it causes, the advancement in military tactics and technology that it causes, and then the fact that the war, the treaty actually sort of has an impact on how we think about statehood, nationhood, the impact, the sort of interface between political systems and cultural systems, particularly religious systems. That has a big event. We could really justify ending the course, I think, in 1648. Now, are there other dates or moments that I think we could discuss? Well, both an event and a process that might be important would be the New World, in the sense that the discovery of the New World is a one-time finite event. It's 1492 and that date. That being said, the conquest and colonization of the New World is in fact a long-term process that, on one hand, has other kind of big turning points, whether it's Cortez conquering the Aztecs, Pizarro conquering the Inca, the establishment of Jamestown in 1607. But for it to be really kind of important in a world historical sense, it's really it's a longer term process that takes centuries. So it's this massive ongoing project. And you could say, I think that really does also change the tenor of the course. I mean, up till now, we've really been talking just about warfare in Western Eurasia. Again, we've shifted our geography around a little bit. Sometimes we've talked about events in what we would call the Middle East today. We've talked about events in the Mediterranean, which includes North Africa and the Levant. But we've been pretty much focused in one kind of big region, which I've referred to kind of as shorthand Western Eurasia. After the process of New World colonization, European warfare is global, and of course it's global also because of the globalization of European commerce with Portuguese contacts in India. And we're reading about that in Andrade, the fact that there's this synergy between Chinese and European military developments. But with the New World, truly all European warfare is going to be global. That's why, like, basically George Washington, as a young militia officer in the Pennsylvania backcountry, starts what will become the 7 Years' War, because events taking place in North America now have an impact on the geopolitics of Europe, and that synergy continues. And remember, why does Louis XVI, let's take it back to 1789, why does he have to summon the Estates General? I believe actually 1788. Why does he summon the Estates General and ask them to raise taxes? And instead of raising taxes, they instead vote to constitute themselves as a constitutional assembly and kick off this huge revolutionary crisis. Why does he have to do this in the first place? If he hadn't summoned that assembly, there would be no French Revolution. But why does he do it? He needs to raise the taxes because he's broke. Why is he broke? He's broke because of the American War. The French intervention in the American Revolution is what ultimately bankrupts the French state and is the immediate trigger of the events of the French Revolution. So there again, the impact of a war in America, of a petty Creole revolt in North America, has huge consequences for what's going on in Europe. So I would actually say that we could argue that the process of colonization in North America fundamentally changes what European warfare looks like. And of course, because it's hard to pick an exact date for that process, we could just say, well, we're going to end in 1492, or we're going to end in 1607. I mean, but you could justify a kind of ending that captures that once we get the Americas integrated into European military politics, that warfare is going to be very different. So, let's say, I think I could legitimately say I want to end this course in 1492, because once the Americas are there, this changes everything. This is a huge, extraordinary discontinuity. Now, one other development, which I've stressed, is a fundamental development in this course, is of course gunpowder. That's why you had to read a whole darn book on gunpowder. Admittedly, this is a development that in some ways represents many different little developments. I don't think it would make sense actually to end the course in 1326, which is our first evidence for a European gun. Remember that jar gun with the guy trying to shoot a giant arrow out of a jar. Yes, we're at guns. That's going to be a huge turning point. That's going to be the start of a whole series of technological developments. But 1326 is not. That's still a pretty primitive start to the development of European gun technology. And indeed, if we wanted to say, okay, I think guns are that's the development that transforms everything. Yes, it takes time. Could we pick a date that kind of captures when that transformation takes place? I'll be honest, I think we can. it would probably be 1453. Now, a couple of things happened in 1453. Famously, is a sort of strange little coincidence of history. Constantinople falls, and the 100 Years comes to a close with a French victory. After the French had been losing almost the whole darn time, they pull out a win. It's convenient, again, for us saying, how can we find a date that sort of captures the ascendance of the gun? 1453, both of those military victories, the victory of the Ottoman Turks and the victory of the French, are due to gunpowder technology, because the Turks blow the walls of Constantinople down. And the reason that they finally smashed the Byzantines after the Arabs and the Seljuk Turks, a lot of people have tried to smash the Byzantines and can chase Byzantine armies around, but cannot deal with the extraordinary fortifications of Constantinople. And the Ottoman Turks blow Constantinople, they just blow it open. So that's an event, a significant event, but nonetheless an event that shows the culmination of a development, gunpowder technology. Similarly, the reason the French have beat the English is they've gotten really good at guns. Joan of Arc was good at guns, and the last battles of the 100 Years' War show the superiority of French gunpowder technology. So, in some ways, I'll be honest, if I had my druthers, if I just walked into the chair's office and said, darn it, I want to change the end date of this course, I think I might actually end it in 1453. Yes, we're technically still in the Middle Ages. Yes, there are some developments that will continue to be important. But once we have this sort of maturation, 1453 shows that gunpowder technology is a truly decisive element on the battlefield, I think that's the great. Everything else is simply going to be guns getting better and better and better. So I don't know if I could really justify ending it much earlier, unless it was going to be a radically different course. I mean, obviously there's other discontinuities, such as the fall of Rome. I mean, you could certainly very easily just teach this course on ancient military history. But 1453 is both in a series of two big events, military events, that also, I think, captures extraordinary development. Now, again, there is no perfect dividing line. And again, any attempt to parse an undergraduate course is going to be at a certain level crude. And for our purposes, we have some advantages of going past 1453. We got to think about the impact of the New World on European geopolitics. We got to think about the culture of religious violence. Maybe not a happy thing to think about, but an important thing to think about. Once Protestantism transforms the European religious and cultural politics, it becomes a major flashpoint for warfare. And we got to think about the further perfection of gunpowder technology. Again, a series of developments that continues to transform infantry tactics, from pike and shot tactics using relatively crude guns to the thinning of infantry lines under Gustav Adolphus, to with the development of the socket bayonet just before the turn of the 18th century, the creation of the kind of infantry tactics of all, equipping essentially all of your infantry with gunpowder muskets, and then being able to hold their own, which also really transforms how gunpowder armies fight. So these are all developments we got to think about because we didn't end in 1453. So that is our course. I'll be putting out some guidance on, the final paper is already out. I'll be putting up a way for you guys to turn it in, and I'll be putting out the sort of final reflection prompt after the paper's due. You'll have several days it's a short assignment, you'll have several days. I wish we could have met under better circumstances. We probably would have learned much more had we stayed at Albany, but I hope we at least salvaged something after this ship got shot down and sank to the bottom. All right, we will chat soon. I hope to see you all, hopefully in person, maybe with a mask, next year.